Today is Tuesday, June 11th. The Developmental Disabilities Administration welcomes you to the DDA Educational Series webinar. Today's topic is the SIS, which is the Supports Intensity Scale adult version, and its use in person-centered planning. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few things about the webinar. This webinar is open to all stakeholders and will be recorded and put on the DDA website. All participants are in listen-only mode. There are two options for listening to the webinar, by computer and by phone. If you have trouble hearing, you may try switching modes by clicking on the appropriate button on the webinar panel in the audio section. There aren't any handouts for today's webinar, but we will be recording the webinar, and a link will be shared in a follow-up email. We will put the series on the DDA website, and all the sessions will soon be posted. Questions can be typed in the question box, which is in the webinar panel, and they will be read and answered out loud as long as they relate to today's topic. Any questions not answered today will go out in an email of FAQs, frequently asked questions, from DDA. So we have our presenter for today, who is from the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, also known as AAIDD, and her name is Natalie Ely, and she is the Senior SIS Trainer for AAIDD. So welcome. Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Natalie, you with us?
Thank you. Yep, thank you, Donna. I
Great.
appreciate the introduction. Yes, I will just reiterate that the folks that are on with us today, because we have you on a muted platform, please feel free to add into the chat box any questions or thoughts that you have, and I will sure do my best to address those as the topics come up. But also, we really want to respect your time, so we really will hold to that 1 o'clock hour to complete this call and to complete this webinar. So if I don't get to your questions, please know, as Donna mentioned, that we will have a follow-up to be able to address those things. And if they don't relate directly to this, share them with us, and we will be sure to be able to get back to, as sometimes things that come up during webinars don't always relate specifically, but we want to really try to keep to these three outcomes. So on your screen, hopefully you see that we're going to tackle three things. We do have that limited time to do so, so you may find that I walk through some of the components more quickly than others. The reason I will do that is because I really want to focus on person-centered planning in this conversation. And I want to talk to you more about how to understand the tool, but also know what the components are, and then how to really interpret the results. So when you hear me talk about the SIS-A, I'm talking about the Supports Intensity Scale adult version. SIS-A is just an easier way for us to refer to it, and the reason we do is that we also have a SIS-C that's for children. So the A is there to help make sure that we stay focused on what adults might need support in and what we're going to talk about today. I don't want to spend too much time on why it's used. In fact, I've given you the link to look at the DDA website. This might help you also to figure out maybe what the history is around why the SIS is used. What I pointed out here in green is that there were a variety of assessments looked at, and they chose SIS-A for its consistency and information. But please do feel free to go ahead and look at the website for more information. I've also included here a few of the reasons, not only for the consistency's sake. We're going to talk a lot about today is the frequency, type, and intensity of support, and how the SIS helps people realize that and figure that piece out for planning. There's an employment section that relates to those supports. We have a section that talks about medical supports as well as behavior support. You'll notice also that we're going to focus on the person's current needs in some of the sections. And then also, when we think about current need, we're also going to want to focus on what supports really are needed at the time, which sometimes are different than what are provided. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that difference. You'll hear me talk a lot about reliability and validity, two words that often come up with assessments and have helped keep the SIS-A tested and have the integrity that it does. There's also a lot of ways to use the SIS. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but really today we're going to focus in on individual supports. So like Donna mentioned at the beginning, AAIDD, or the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. If you're not familiar with us, please feel free to go to our website. Just a helpful idea of what the focus is here is just that AAIDD helped to create and put the SIS in place. And so if you want more information about that, please find out about us through our website. All right, when you first start to hear about SIS-A, you might hear about it from Telegen. So Telegen is the group that has the SIS-A supported interviewers that go out and actually gather the information. And if you're curious about more of how do we make sure that that Telegen interviewer is really doing a great job, we oftentimes you might hear us talk about an IRQR. So I just put this in here just so you know that there's this level of review and level of training that goes into making sure that those folks are being reliable and valid interviewers. Let's talk a little bit now about the SIS-A itself. So once you've been invited to that interview, or maybe you are wondering what it is that you've received in this family-friendly report, I want you to know a little bit about the history. So it took about 5 years for AAIDD to help the actual authors put together the SIS. Originally, it was published way back in 2004, but actually was updated into 2015, and that's where we got that SIS-A title. So sometimes you'll hear people talk about SIS or SIS Classic. That's what was in place before. With SIS-A, it's an updated version, but it actually has all the same elements of the original tool. When you think about how this is different from other tools that you might use, whether they're assessment tools or planning tools, this slide might help you to start to think about the differences. And I'll pull us right to the middle, which talks about it's directly measuring support. So there are times when people are maybe in that interview and trying to figure out what that support looks like. Some folks want to focus in on what the person can or can't do. And that interviewer is going to help that team start to move away from that. While it might be a great starting point to kind of think about where that person is helping us with each item, we actually want to spend more time thinking about what are the supports in place to help that person be successful. So it's a planning tool, and it comes from this group perspective. We've also talked a little bit about there are multiple ways to use this tool. Today, we're going to really focus in on that individual level, but also know that there's other ways that people use this tool. In fact, if I have some ideas as we move into practical uses of the tool, I might talk a little bit about how agencies or people that support individuals can think about this tool as a useful way to maybe think in a new way of how to support people. Okay, so let's say you're in that interview and you're looking at what it is that you're really going to be measuring. 3 words that really stand out in how this SIS is holding up in its integrity is that it's standardized. And by standardized, it means that we're going to ask everyone the same questions. So everyone has the right to answer and have that opportunity to talk through all of the items in the tool. Sometimes this can be a real challenge for people in that maybe they think, you know, I haven't thought about the person in this capacity before, or it doesn't relate to what they're doing right now. And that's okay. That interviewer is going to help you think through what those needs are going to look like and ask all the questions just to give everyone that fair opportunity. When we talk about a tool being reliable, what we're looking for here is that the tool measures consistently. So whether you receive or have one intelligent interviewer and then the next time work with another, they're all going to be consistent in what they ask and how they administer the tool. So we want to really hold up reliability, not only in the interviewer, but in also the tool itself. Another reason why we want to make sure everyone gets asked those same questions. When it comes to validity, the SIS-A has a lot of strong validity, which means that it actually measures what it says it's going to measure. And you'll notice that I've already talked a lot about the idea of support, and that's what this tool really is designed to do, measure that pattern and intensity of support. So those are just 3 things to think about as you start to think about how is this tool effective and why is it being used and reliable, valid, and standardized. Okay, so when the actual authors were coming up with why the SIS is an important tool and why it really helps people with disabilities, these 5 trends are the drivers of the tool. So when you look at the tool itself, maybe you're in the interview and you start to think about, boy, these are questions that I hadn't thought about before for this person, or why are we focused on this part of life? It's to help you move forward and progress in your thinking for that individual. Same for the individual. Let's say that you're in the interview and they're starting to think, well, I'm not sure what I would do in this case. Number 2 talks about the functional descriptions, meaning that we really want to think more about what the person needs to get through those day-to-day life than just maybe a label or something that has been applied to the person as an indicator of who they are. We really aren't concerned with that. We want to focus more on what needs to happen, the action in that person's life to help them be successful. The third one talks more about how we want to make sure we have age-appropriate activities, meaning that we're going to really talk about adult life activities. We also want to keep it true to the culture of that person. So there'll be times in the interviews where you might have examples that fit a certain culture. We want to definitely incorporate those in because as you're planning for that person, it'll be great for people to know what they're thinking about that really fits to that community. Let's see, let me see if I can find out some more questions here. So it's looking like we're starting to get some people in the chat box, and I appreciate that. Keep the questions coming. And let's see. It looks like there's a question around the trajectory reflected in the PCP. Okay, so yeah, the PCP tool we're going to get to, and I hope that I'll be able to address this question as we move more into how the tool is used. With that in mind, I'm going to keep us moving because these are more of the reasons why the tool is created. And when you're in an interview or when you're gathering information and thinking through what the right supports are for the person, these are some of the reasons that it was created. So it does align with person-centered planning, but it's more of the reasons why behind the scores that you'll see or the ratings that you'll see in the tool itself. Same with the ideas of the fundamentals here. This very much aligns with person-centered thinking in that we want people with disabilities to experience those same rights. We want to make sure that they can explore their dreams, discover things, and participate. I am noticing that there's some folks that are having some issue with audio, and I appreciate that. I'm going to see if I can adjust my mic because it sounds like there's audio cutting in and out. I apologize for that. I'll really try to see if I can adjust it. Please do let me know if you still have some of those issues coming up. Okay, we've talked a little bit about some of the basics behind the tool, why and where it was created. I want to talk now about the actual components so that it gives you just another strong foundation of what the tool is so that when you receive it or when you're thinking about planning, you know how to use it. There are 3 sections in this SIS-A. You'll notice that we have them listed here on the screen, and oftentimes you'll hear the interviewer maybe talk about section 1 or section 2. In this case, the exceptional medical needs and behavioral support needs, that's section 1. Our support needs index, this is section 2, and this is the core of the SIS assessment. It oftentimes is the section that a lot of people focus more on because it's the bulk of the assessment, and it's also the norm section or the indexed section of the tool. The third section, the supplemental protection and advocacy scale, is a great area for people to start to think maybe in a new way about that person or how to help them. But also these are some pretty critical parts of life. So as you start to think about planning and perhaps that person is ready for a new challenge, this could be a great section to pull some ideas out of too. When you're in the interview itself and you're trying to figure out what's that best support for that person, I want to give you an idea of what that looks like. So the first is that it's a semi-structured interview, which really means that the interviewer is going to be there to help guide the conversation. But let's say there's maybe something that you really want to make sure you talk about or you're concerned about. You can always move back and forth between sections. Don't feel like you have to go through it from front to back and never return to a section or an idea. You're always welcome to go back and forth. We're also going to talk about respondents here in a minute, but know that we need at least two. And the respondent is you, that person that's giving the information about the individual and very much the individual themselves. So if you are a part of this, know that you'll need at least two folks and that individual to be there. Again, just a reminder, and I'm just kind of sliding down this or skipping down this slide, so just remember that we're not there to measure what the person can or can't do. We're thinking about the supports for success. So when you're starting to think about what success looks like, you'll also notice that each item is complex. It has multiple steps, and it's that team working together to try to figure out that best support. Okay, so I mentioned that idea of the respondents. In this case, what I'd like us to think about with respondents is we're looking for someone who knows that person well, at least 3 months time, but really a year is great for that minimum amount of time that you've known the person. And some folks might say, you know, I've known this person a lot of years. What we're looking for when we say known is that you've had some time to really spend with that person and support the person in at least one setting in their life or part of their life. But if you've been there in more parts of their life too, it's great because you can bring that perspective. You can also give examples from the person's life. So we're looking for people who have known that person well in many settings to really give us a good idea of what those supports would look like. And those two words I've used quite a bit, that idea of the interviewer, that's that person that's been trained to help conduct the tool or administer it, and then you as the reviewer. You're there as a team, you're working together. That interviewer, oftentimes think of them as like the expert in the tool itself, but you as the respondents really drive this because you're the ones that know the person well and can speak to what those supports are really going to look like and why. Okay, so far it looks like we're doing okay with chat box, but please continue to think about that. Okay, picture yourself in that interview now, and you're thinking through section 1. If you'll remember, that's that section around medical and behavioral support. Important pieces to think about in this section, not only if you're in the interview, but when you receive the report, is that this section captures current support. So we're thinking about what type of things are in place right now to help maybe maintain what's happening for that individual or treat things or even prevent things from happening. The other thing that's important about this section is remember that all the scores you see represent exceptional support. Exceptional, you might also hear them use in the terminology that's on this slide where they say maybe it's over and above or it's beyond what other people might need. It's very possible that supporters have had to be trained to help that person in a medical or a behavioral support need. There's only three ratings for this section. You'll notice we either get a 0, 1, or a 2. When you actually get the report, it looks something like this. So I've just cut and paste what the rating key for section 1 looks like in the report to give you some more indication as to what the differences are between that 0, that 1, or a 2. You'll notice that we have kind of these bigger areas for no support and some support, and that extensive support often is for folks that really have very high needs. Not only maybe is it about the particular specialization of the supports being provided, but that it affects a lot of their life. Maybe it's a very significant support that you have to provide. It's very intense. It may also take a lot of time. So that's more of what our 2 supports look like. In the medical section, there's these 4 areas that we look at. And then we have an other section. That other is where we capture some of those things that we didn't talk about in the other 4 areas, but that often relate to what medical support that person might need. So if you're in an interview and you're starting to think through, let's say you think, oh, I'm not quite sure, remember that you can always come back to this section if you need to. This is an example of what it might look like when you're in the interview, or I'm sorry, not in the interview, when you receive the report itself. So for you to be able to read that family friend report and look at it pretty quickly, you'll notice that we've already ordered for you level of importance. So if you were in the interview and you had something that really needed a lot of support, that's going to rise to the top. In fact, you'll see with this example, we have number 19 falls before the 1, the 2, and the 3. That's because it was that extensive support and they wanted to make sure that they captured that. So it's just a way to help you see the items quickly and know that whatever is at that top is what was scored the highest. Much like the medical supports, the behavior supports capture that same idea that we're looking for current support and exceptional need. The other thing that I love about this section is that our focus is on prevention. So when we start to think about these areas of support, you'll see the 4 here. We want to think about what are the preventions in place. And one tip to teams, when you're in the interview itself, sometimes you don't even think about the supports you're providing because they've just become common nature. They're things that you've always done. Or if you're the individual, you're not always aware of those supports that people provide you because it's a part of your life and it's working well. So as you start to think about what those supports look like, be ready to give some maybe detail of what you do, or you might even have that interviewer helping you think through what those supports look like so that we can get a clear indication of either the preventions that are in place or also the things you do to help that person stay safe or keep others safe. Here's an example of what behaviors looks like, the behavior support section looks like. Again, from that report that you'll receive, you'll notice that same idea is in place where it's highlighted in a different color and they've listed the supports that have scored higher than others. All of them will be listed on the page, but it's just a way to help keep that maybe at the front of your mind, the priorities or the things that scored during the interview. Okay, let's move on to the second section. So you'll remember section 2 is the indexed portion of the tool. This is the biggest portion, and oftentimes for me when I'm helping people plan, I spend a lot of time in this section because it touches on many parts of daily life. And it's also great, like if you have any kind of investigative or problem-solving mind, I love to put this section together and find the trends or the thread that ties each of them together and have that be that focus in planning. So when you see this section, just remember that we're really trying to think about exploring parts of life that maybe the person hasn't had access to, or that maybe they're being supported in a way now that we could look at modifying or changing to help them live that fuller life. Maybe it's them being in a more participatory way of being a part of life, or having that meaningful support where you're not doing too much for the person, but also not maybe putting off something that you would be able to support and that person would be a part of that life. That big picture is what we're looking at here. Supported success is a term that you might hear while you're in the interview, but also for me, it's really important when I work with teams to help them think about, we really want to make sure that with the right things in place, those supports by people, or maybe it's resources, that person can be successful. If you keep that strengths-based approach where you're really trying to think through what's that life that we want to be living, what's that thing that we want to accomplish, and how do we get there, it helps that team focus in on what they really want to do to help that person. This is just another visual for you to start to think about what we mean by supported success. So we always think about that person. We're always thinking about the help that they might need from other people, and knowing that we get that completed task by doing those things together. When you think about supported success, and especially when you see the ratings or the scores in that report, remember that these are the 3 things that are also represented there. So first of all, when you're in that interview, the team would have been thinking through involving that person in every activity. So the rate that you see there represents that thought first, is that we're going to think about the person involved. We're going to think about the support or the success that we want to make sure we accomplish and not just do for the person. What would really be needed, or what would it take? And then finally, we want to think about that local community and what the community would expect, so that we're keeping that standard or that indication true to the community of that individual. With those 3 things in place, we're going to make sure we tackle every item. So we want to complete all of those. We want to think about if the person needs any kind of assistive device or currently uses assistive devices. We want to keep those in place. So a great example here is, for instance, I use contacts. And if I didn't have glasses or something in my eyes to be able to help me with what I see, I would really not do well in my community. So with the help of glasses, I'm able to do so much more. And those are the kind of assistive devices we want to think about. Maybe it's a communication device or a device for mobility. Keep those in mind as you score in this section. Also know that if you receive that report, this was included as they started to think through the reports that are needed. There are 5 things that we want to think about as we try to figure out that pattern and intensity of support. So a lot of times when we show this slide to people who are learning more about how to collect data, we talk through these areas and think through, this is how you would get to the score that you need. Maybe it's specific to the setting that we're in, or maybe it's the fact that you have certain people that have very high behavior support needs. For me, when I'm thinking about planning, I also like to think about these 5 sections and make sure that we've tackled all of them to create a great outcome or create a plan that really is going to fit for a person. I've made the mistake of thinking, you know what, we have this great outcome, we're going to help this person find a job, and maybe I've forgotten, oh yeah, and we also forgot that he's going to need behavior support every time he goes to the job, and we didn't always put that in place. So for me, this is just a great 5 quick checkpoints to say, did we think of all these things as we were trying to think through how to help this person? And then know that it's reinforced when you see the ratings in the SIS itself. Okay, with section 2, that's that normed section or the index, and section 3, we have the same rules that we're going to look at. And we've talked a little bit about this already, this idea that we want to complete all the items. We want to think about what's necessary, not maybe what's currently being provided or has been provided in the past. We want to have at least those 2 people that know them well, including the individual as much as possible, and then assistive devices. So just to reinforce what we've talked a little bit about, but are important to knowing not only if you're in the interview, but also if you receive that report. Another visual here to help you start to think through the difference of how this may be different than other tools you're using in planning, but also how to think about how to help this person in planning is this visual that we have here. So on the left-hand side, you'll notice we think about that individual and who they are right now. And then on the far side, we think about the standards of our community. Both have expectations and responsibilities and ways to be involved. But when we think about that standard of other adults, the way that we help that person bridge that gap is through 3 areas of support. We want to talk about the type of support they might need. This is like the actual thing that you as the supporter might need to do. How often you need to help, what kind of support you're providing, how often you're doing that, and then that time that it takes you. These 3 ratings work together to help tell a true or a full comprehensive story of what that support looks like. So on the screen now, I've just given you an example of what you'll see in the interview. And it oftentimes is the part that a lot of teams spend a lot of time on because they've really got to think through and maybe even pull apart portions of what that daily life looks like to figure out the score that's the best fit. So let's take an example. So in home living, for instance, that's one section of the tool. There's an item that talks about preparing food. And when you think about preparing food, there's so many steps that could go into that. So that interviewer is there to help the team think through, what do we mean by preparing food, and maybe what do we not include in this section? They're going to be the guide to help you with that. But very briefly, we think about preparing breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks. We maybe think about cutting up lettuce for a salad or using the stove or the oven. So when teams start to think through, okay, what's the best fit for all of those things? Type of support helps us figure out, and for me, because I'm maybe more of a visual person, I have to kind of think through what are the steps that I need to do the most of to help that person successfully prepare their food. So you'll notice with type, we have more of this idea of no support all the way to full support. And one of the challenges, I think, as a person trying to think through support, you oftentimes think, well, I have to do something. The person supporting them doing something. So it must mean that I'm providing physical support for that full. When in fact, what we're thinking more about is what you're doing and how it's helping the person. Even though you might be physically doing something, so for instance, maybe you're helping to model how to put together the salad. You know, I would do this and I would do this, and the person then would get a chance to do it. Even though you're using your physical body, you might actually be doing something more like a number 2, prompting or demonstrating for the person what to do. So when you think through type of support, think through best fit, meaning we want to think of what fits the entire item, not just portions. But we also want to think through what do I as that supporter need to do? Or if you're the individual, this is your great chance to let people know what you need. So maybe they've always been making that salad for you and you're ready to give it a try. I've had great conversations in interviews where the person says, you know what, you've always done that, let me try it, let me do it, but you need to show me what to do. And we can have those kind of in-depth conversations. Once you've figured out what it is that you as a supporter are doing or what needs to be happening for that individual, we move into frequency. So with frequency, we're now talking about how often the support is needed. Some differences here with frequency that sometimes happens is people start to think of how often, in this case, preparing food that we've talked about, like how often the person is preparing their food. That's not what we're capturing here. We're actually capturing the support that's needed. So there are some people that do great on their breakfast, or there are some people even that can do a full day without needing support. This is where we get to show that differentiation. This is where we get to say, you know, there are some people that need the support monthly, weekly, daily, even every hour on the hour. So we've given you a clear range to think through as a team. And then we move to that daily support time. And I will say with daily support time, this is a challenge for teams because as you probably think about, you know, it's not like we start the timer or we set the watch to say, okay, I'm about to start to help you preparing food and let's time it. You know, so there are times when this is a really great time to have more than one person there so the team can think through the range that best fits. Because you'll notice also at the top is the idea of cumulative time. So we're going to be adding up the moments of support throughout the day that you're providing that help to think through what's the best range or best fit for the person. Anything from no support all the way to 4 hours and more. So I've given some good time to think through those 3 ratings. The reason I do is because when you start to look at the report and you're wondering what does the 3 mean, what does the 2 mean, having a clear idea of what the ratings are will really help you to make sure that you're thinking through how can we make sure we put the right plan in place. So knowing the rating key will really help you. Also, it's really a great reminder, just remember, those ratings that you're seeing are not necessarily what's currently happening. Those are great places to jump off to and think through planning. But also, they're sometimes very community specific. So if you weren't a part of that interview and you want to make sure you're thinking through a rating that fits for the person, also remember that community that they're a part of. The third point in this slide that I think is really important to remember is that the support you see in the actual report is really anyone could be providing these. So we're not worried about if you were paid or not. We're not worried if maybe you're a loved one or a friend of that individual. We're just thinking through what would the support look like regardless of who provides it. So it represents anyone who could provide those supports and what they would need to do. I'm going to go through a few examples of what it could look like. If you haven't seen a report, these are some of the things to be aware of and to know that you'll see. So here you see home living. This is our first section, our life domain. In section 2, you'll notice that this, just like the other section, has been reordered. So we have number 5 at the top, 1, 2, 3. That's because we've already prioritized for you the highest scores. So for some people in planning, they like to see where the most support is needed so they can figure out how to make sure to capture that or take care of that. But for me, when I'm starting to think through how to help someone, let's say they really want to focus on a part of life that maybe that they're doing really well. So I might even move all the way down to the final one, which in this case is dressing, and figure out what is going well. So If you're a planner or if you've used some of the planning tools, you'll notice there's questions in there about what is working and what is not working. One way to help strategize teams and thinking through it is to look at where maybe lower supports are needed and why is that the case. What's in place where people don't need to be there as much, and see those as ways to help be a jumping off point for maybe using the same techniques in other parts of the person's life or figuring out what's going well. Okay, I'm going to move through these a little bit quicker here just because I just want to give you them as examples. Again, you'll notice though that this is what it would look like if you get that report. We have community living. It's ordered in a way that shows higher supports above, lower supports on the bottom. Some notes are included here. Lifelong learning. If you are thinking about focused areas and are part of planning, you'll notice that the wording and the words that we talk about throughout this really align well with that. Here we have employment. Same idea, same concept, where we have higher supports in the top. We have general comments at the bottom. Again, we have those scores of 3s and 2s and 1s. We've given you an indication as to what those numbers mean by using the wording that best aligns with that. But again, if you have questions on that or you want to find out more about what that looks like, sometimes it's great to talk through with the team that was a part of the interview process to figure that piece out. Health and safety, another important piece to planning and thinking through supports, social activities, and then finally our section 3. So this is that supplemental section. It talks through 8 sections of life to think about that overlap into a lot of parts of our life. Same scoring, and also can be helpful in planning. I want to take a few more minutes now, and I'm just going to just double check that our chat box is going okay. Please feel free to add in questions. And I also just want to check in on time. So we have, let's see, probably a little bit more time together. I want to focus on what the scores mean, and then I'm going to dive into some strategies. I also hope that throughout this presentation, you've heard some ideas to start to think about to help you in planning. Okay, so you've received that report, and now you wonder, what does it all mean? Basically, that family-friendly report, or what you actually receive with the SIS information, starts out with some demographic information, tells you a little bit about when the interview was completed and who was a part of it. It's just a great way to get a basic idea or foundation. Section 1, this is that medical behavioral section. And what you'll notice here is just adding up of the columns. So it's a very simple addition of anything that's scored a 1 or a 2 gets added up and is rated here. For me, I think of this as your starting point, or maybe your flag that you're looking at to say, okay, in this section we had some scores. Now let's dive into them and see what those things mean. So think of that final total as just a great indication as, oh, yep, this was a score, an area that we scored in. I better take a look at it and see more of how that could help us with planning. Here's an example of that. Also, it looks like that there are maybe a lot of questions coming in. We appreciate that. Do continue to add those in. We're going to hold them until we get toward the end, but also make sure that you know that we're going to be addressing those things at another point too, and get those to you. Now we're in section 2. How do we score this section? We add up the 3 ratings: type, frequency, daily support. We get that total, and that total becomes what we call a raw score. So in this example, you'll notice we have 3 2s, they score to a 6. We add up all those total scores, and they give us 2 things that I think is really important to know. The first is a standardized score. A standardized score is how we take whatever the raw scores are for this section and apply it to the group of folks that helped us to create this tool. So this is that part where we think through, all of us have been asked the same questions. This is what you scored in this section. And now that's related to, it was about 1,300 folks that helped us originally to come up with that norm tool. And we're going to think through, how does what support you need relate to the folks that helped us? We have a standard score, and then we have a percentile score. In fact, when we think through what do those things do for us as an individual, it might just give you a good starting point to say, you know what, we really want to focus this year on, like, let's say the person says, I really want to make more friends. Well, I, as a person in helping them and thinking through how the SIS can help them, I might look at that standard score in social support. The standard score may not mean as much to me, but when I look at the percentile ranking, I know it's 50%, meaning that person falls right in the middle of other folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their needs. And let's think about how we can help support them. In another example here, we can see how you have that standard score giving you the idea of what the person's needs are in relation to others. This is that idea of fairness and consistency. And again, where I talked about that example of social support, you see here with this example, we even have like where they're maybe at the 25th percentile. That means that there are folks with probably about 75% that need more support than that person. I love this graph too. So when you get that report, another quick indicator to say, okay, how can this report help us in planning, is start to think through what parts of the person's life really represents a lot of support needs or less, and how can we learn or blend both of them together. The support needs index, this is just one section of the tool that sometimes can make people feel like, okay, what does the support needs index mean? As an individual, I think for me, it's like when you do any other assessment, it gives you an indication as to where you fall in relation to others that have also taken this assessment. So in this case, we have an example of a 39. That means that 39 out of 100% of support needs. So there's people that have a lot more support needs than this individual. And then in this case, there could also be folks that have a lot less. I've given you some examples here to show you the differences in how this helps if you're part of a team and maybe a member of more than one person's team. You can start to see how differences in the support needs look across the individuals that you work with. That support needs index is just that quick indicator to be more of a comprehensive look at all of the domains. In this case, the person's support needs index is 13. We have one here that's at 35 or 55. Another one with very high support needs. You can see how they work together. Okay, so I moved through that section pretty quickly. I really wanted to make sure that I gave you some points to think about as you see those numbers or you see those final scores in the report. But I'd like to spend our last 15 minutes or so together diving into actual strategies. I've touched on some of these throughout our time together, but I want to make sure that I make it more practical, more concrete. So when we're thinking through person-centered planning, a lot of times what makes us nervous is this idea of change. Even as you think about your own life, if you're going to be putting a goal in place or we want to work towards something, it can be really hard for us to think about changing. People can be fearful of it. But one of the things I like about the planning process and also what's in place for you all is that even with your outcomes, you're looking at progress. You're looking more at what have we done differently to help improve this person's life. So when you start to think about how can I help them change what they're doing now, let's think about it from that perspective. What can we do to help them stay focused on that? The first strategy I'd like you to think about is that there's this idea of what's most important to an individual and most important for an individual. And if you use that PCP document, those things are tied into this exactly. So when you see the SIS-A report, you'll notice on the top of this page, we have what it actually looks like in the report, most important for in this case, and then how it directly results, the results could be applied to important for or to me in your PCP document. You'll also know that you have these 9 focus areas that you look at. And each domain within the SIS, especially in section 2, can relate directly to these. We use some of the same wording. You'll notice employment, you'll notice lifelong learning, Some of the things that you're going to be tackling as a team, you can use the SIS to either reinforce what you're thinking or also be the driver to help discussion. So maybe you hadn't thought about a section in life and you want to think through what would the supports look like. Use the SIS to help you in that part of your focus area and have that be that jumping off point for the team. And saying something like, well, in lifelong learning, it looks like one of the areas that you really didn't need as much support or where it looks like it's going really well is in self-determination. So you as a team can start to look at what that rating is for that specific item, and you can start to tie in what learning looks like for that person into your plans. Okay, another thing that I think is important about when you're thinking about those focus areas is to remember the big picture and the holistic look at support. So let's say you're talking about employment for a person. That for us is section 2D, or in section 2, it even is called the employment section. One technique that I like to use, and I've just laid it out real quickly here, is just to review the ranking. So which items scored the highest, which ones scored the lowest, talk through with the team why that maybe is the case. For some teams, when you understand the why behind the ratings, it's so much easier to move into planning. So you start to maybe see patterns of support. You also might say, well, this is an area that we know that we've got to have someone there and helping them through because it's a real challenge for them. Great, make sure you put that into your planning. Also, it's a great place to start discussions and saying, you know, we hadn't thought about this as something to success. For instance, when I look at this example, number 7, changing job assignments, actually scored pretty high for this individual. So if I'm working on how do I make a plan that fits, I want to make sure that we've addressed what happens if a transition is needed, what happens or who needs to be there, what do we need to say, what do we need to do in case these things come up so that we can be much more prepared for that. So that rationale, big picture thinking, a great first way to start to think about using the tool. Another area to start to think about, and I've just tied in here an example that is actually from the website and a guide that I know coordinators for community service use, is to start to think more about that idea of important to and important for. So in the first one that we gave you, that strategy of using most important to and for, one way for me as a planner is to think of them separately, but even more exciting is to think of how can we blend those two things together. The more that you can align what's important to that individual and for them, I think I've seen a lot of success. So the tool helps you do that in that we have both separate, but then also within each domain, when it's indicated during the interview, it's listed per item. So you could very quickly go to this section in the report and just pull out the ones that have become priority, or you could decide, you know, we want to think about as you go through the person-centered planning tool, how can we help use the information to reinforce what we're thinking or to help us if we're stuck. So we talked a little bit about this idea of progress and how to keep focused on that, but also how do we look at maybe more of like monitoring those outcomes and making sure that we put the right things in place based on what's important to that person. Always keeping those at the forefront help us in planning. It also helps us move toward more active engagement. So really trying to make sure that we think through maybe there are new opportunities we haven't thought about, and the SIS tool will help us to see those things, just because you know, you have to look at each of the items to figure out what those scores mean and how we could relate it to that person. Or maybe you decide it's one part of that person's life that we really want to focus on and explore. And using what we've learned from the tool, which is oftentimes for some people those rating key descriptors, will also really help us. Let's see, I see that we have some folks continuing to ask questions, and I appreciate that. And we're going to keep those going. I see that there are a few that, yeah, relate to DDA, and I will definitely let them help us with those questions. But I want to also just make sure that we've captured some things that are helpful for you all. So I know that I talked about these 3 strategies pretty quickly, but I think if anything, I hope that you'll be able to even refer back to this when you need to, or start to think about ways that you can look at the information to help either reinforce what you're already thinking about with planning or give you some new ideas. So again, those strategies about helping the tool or helping use the tool in planning. And then finally, just making sure that you understand what those ratings mean. So I want to just, let's see, make sure you have this information up. So we have about 8 or 9 minutes together. Make sure that you know more about how to find information about the tool. And then I'm going to just pull up some of our questions that are coming up. Oh, great questions. Okay, so let's see. I apologize, there's a lot here, so I'm just trying to find some that maybe make, oh, this person has a great point. So it says, it appears that this process is so standardized that it compromises understanding who the individual really is and seems contrary to person-centered planning. I appreciate that thought, because I think oftentimes as we think about how do I help an individual, if we have something that does seem like, oh, they don't understand me or they don't know me as the individual, we can oftentimes think that it doesn't apply to us. So what I might say to that is, yes, you're right, it is standardized. And yes, we do ask everyone the same questions. Where I've been able to see how it really helps an individual is start to think about how it reinforces what they want to do and why. So a great example for me, I work a lot in employment for people. And let's say they say, I really want this job and I really want to do this. I know that I can then take this tool and look at in this case, usually the top 8 reasons why people with disabilities are let go from a job, and say, okay, then if you really want to do this, we want to make sure we have the right things in place, because that's what we know we really want to stay focused on. So I oftentimes use it to reinforce what the person wants to do and make sure we have the right things in place to do that. I hope that helps you in that thinking. I like that you're seeing that there is some ways that it could be contrary too, because we want to also make sure that we don't just get hung up in just the SIS is the only way or the only tool we used in planning. Not at all. We want to keep involved in that individual's life in what they see as important and what's a part of their life. And if this tool can help them and reinforce those things, great, but it's not the only driver, absolutely not. Okay, so I'm seeing a few other questions. Okay, so we have a question a little bit about person-centered planning. It looks like someone did a process yesterday. The CCS didn't mention the SIS, and it is asking if it's in place yet. So that might be regional. I'm sorry, I don't know for sure if I have a great question or a great response to that, but we will add that to DDA to take a look at. We appreciate you letting us know and making us aware of that. There's some questions in here about how do we make sure that this was completed? Can we request that to be done? I'm going to absolutely keep those questions for DDA to help us, but I may not have a great answer for you today just because I'm not quite sure the entire process on that. Let's see. This is a great response too, and I'm just going to be respectful here of time, so we have about 5 minutes together. I appreciate the honesty in this response. It says, I get that the information you will see on this report is the amount of support needed for the person to be successful, but of course you have to know what someone can do currently in order to figure that out. What is the measurement evaluation of those skills, or did I misunderstand or miss something about this tool? So this is maybe also where we talk through the complexity of the tool. I don't want to throw off our eyes here too much, so I was going to just move back to a slide that might help to relay this a little bit better. While I do that, though, I do want to make sure you know that we do think about personal competency. Like, that's definitely can be a starting point, but it's not our ending point in the tool. So an example I might think about is if I'm the person trying to think through what would the support actually look like, I might have to start with thinking, well, what is the person doing, and then how do I help them? So personal competence is definitely an influence in figuring out what supports are needed. It's just not the stopping point, because we want to keep that strength-based approach. Another, trying to think of a more concrete example, might be when we think through something as, let's see, like a pretty concrete thing like getting dressed. So if I can think about how the person gets dressed and what they do first, then I can start to focus in on what do I need to do for them to be successful at that. So it's a visual that you can think through, and then you apply the type of support to it. So while we take into account skill, we just don't stop there. We think now about what would it look like to help that person be successful. Okay, I am going to just take a look here at some more questions. Some of these relate to the more about maybe the tool itself and how it's used in the state. I'm going to leave those to the state to help us with those. And who will receive it. Oh, this one jumps back a little bit, but I think is a great point. So one of the questions is, how does one prevent an emotional outburst? And I guess one question or one answer to that is very carefully. Sometimes we can't prevent. So I want to make sure that I didn't mislead you in thinking through what this means. So I'm going to just hope that this person is thinking through something like what you see here. So when you get the exceptional behavioral support needs, you'll notice that the actual word that begins emotional outbursts is the prevention of that. While some folks can't prevent the outburst from happening, some can prevent it from scaling up or becoming more of an issue or happening more often. So even though it maybe doesn't mean that you have figured out how to prevent it from happening completely, you as a team have put things in place to maybe circumvent some of the severity of that, or you've also figured out as a team, how do we help calm that person down, help them get back to a place where they feel more in control, and those all get included here. So don't think about it happening like an all or nothing. Think of this more as representing what the team discussed about emotional outbursts and how they support that. There's some questions in here about ASL and making sure that you have translators. Those are great questions to the state to make sure that they have those things in place. We appreciate that. We have some folks saying they don't remember seeing this tool being used for either their family members or for people that they work with. Those are great for our team to know about too. So please keep typing into the chat box. We've got about a minute left. And if anything, I hope you'll see that that chat box is a way to keep a log of what people are either having more questions about or want more information about. We surely want to make sure that we can address those. And if anything, this hour was a way for us to have this be a jumping off point for discussion. I also want to make sure that we've given you what we started out to do, which is talk about the 3 areas of what this focus is. So while we're finishing up here, I want to just take us back to the very beginning. And just remember that we talked a little bit more about the purpose of the tool. This, again, remember, is thinking through why it was created, those 5 trends that stand behind it, the principles about people with disabilities having full lives and how this helps to support that. we talked about components. So when you actually get that SIS report, there's those 3 sections and what those look like to help you understand what that report means. And when we think about interpreting results, there are multiple ways, but we touched on 3. We just started simply in thinking through what parts of the report help you reinforce what's the most important to the person or for the person. That's that individualized part of planning. It helps you to prioritize and reinforce those things. It also helps you to maybe think through parts of life that the person hasn't had a chance to work on yet or tackle yet. You as a team can start to think about that too. So we so appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us, and we will get out these answers to you as soon as we can. Thank you, folks.